This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Thank you to all my patrons who support the podcast. You too can have an ad-free experience of the podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/gracefulatheist. If you are doubting, deconstructing, or deconverting, you do not have to do it alone. Our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, is trying to be a safe place to land. Join us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Joanna Johnson. Joanna has written the book Silenced in Eden, that is a memoir of her experience growing up as a dedicated Christian, experiencing sexual trauma as a young child, growing up within a family and extended family of Christians, trying to fulfill the expectations of being a Christian, trying to go into ministry. The purity culture she experienced, the sexism and repression were common throughout her life. Jo is an obvious leader, and that showed throughout her Christian journey as she was a leader in various places, but always was held back. You can find her book, Silenced in Eden, on Amazon. Of course, there'll be links in the show notes. But before we begin, I want to read a statement from Jo. Silenced in Eden is meant to be a voice for all who have been silenced and encourage others to speak their painful truths. Because of this, $1 from each book sale will go to the nonprofit Louder Than Silence. Louder Than Silence exists to provide survivors of sexual violence with the community and resources needed to gain hope and healing. They focus on paying for EMDR trauma therapy, hosting workshops and retreats, providing self-care kits, and much more. Their biggest dream is that survivors know that they are not alone and have a foundation of support among other survivors as they navigate their journeys together. If you are a survivor of sexual trauma, I would very highly recommend that you reach out to Louder Than Silence. And thank you to Jo for making that a part of her book sales. Here is Joanna Johnson telling her story. Jo Johnson, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Jo, you have written a really powerful book called Silenced in Eden. It is a memoir. It's really raw and honest, and we're going to get to hear a bit of that story as you tell us here today. Thank you for reaching out, first of all, for wanting to be on the podcast, and I'm excited you're here.
Thank you. Yeah, I love what you do. I love the thing I love most about this podcast is it's people who have deconverted or deconstructing, reaching out and like helping other people who are in it. And like that was the whole motivation of writing for me was this idea that like those who came before can help those who are in it now.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Jo, since your memoir is your story, we're basically going to go over the book in telling your story. But as we always talk about, what was your faith tradition when you were growing up?
Yeah. So I did prepare for that one. So I am a pastor's grandkid.
Okay.
So my grandpa was a pastor. He started a non-denominational charismatic commune. So it was a church, but then people also started living together.
Okay.
And just like with both charismatic, we had praying in tongues. We had my grandma would often see angels. Worship time would never have like a end to it. It would just go as long as it went. But my grandpa passed away. I was only 4. So the church ended shortly after him. And then we were in the world of Calvary Chapel and First Baptist. And my parents, it was kind of like the desert to them because here they are, these very spirit moving, and then they're in dry.
In the Baptist. That's quite a change. Yeah.
Yes, a very, very big change for them. So when I was 16, I actually stumbled onto a non-denominational charismatic church.
Oh, okay. All right.
And So of course, when I went there, I was like, hey, this feels really familiar, right?
Uh-huh.
This
Uh-huh.
seems like what my parents have been telling me church is supposed to be like, because you have very little memory before 5. So I didn't really know. I just saw their Christianity and then the Christianity that was in front of me, and it didn't like line up the same. So I knew that there was a spiritualness or a charismaticness to their faith, but I didn't see it in the church practice that I was growing up in, right?
Got it. Okay. Okay.
So when I see that at 16, I this is what they've been telling me about, and clamored onto it. And that became my entire life.
Yeah.
So at 16, and 16, you're trying to find yourself, you're in high school. I had my 6 months of rebellion, and then I was like, okay, I'm going to be perfect.
Yeah.
And I
Yes.
literally tried to be perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so charismatic church became my life. I actually did 2 years of an unpaid internship where I actually paid to go, to work for them
Right.
for free.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
paying them also. And that was where I met my husband.
Okay.
Yeah, so Christian, everything was church. We were doing leadership together. He ends up on staff at church.
Okay.
We're courting, we're dating, purity culture, right? Well, we're also horny. So
Yeah. Yeah.
kind
And
of
human.
fumbled
Yes.
human, in love for the first time ever.
Yeah.
So we fumble the ball, right? We
Okay.
don't make it to the altar before we make it under the sheets, if you want to say.
Yes. Yeah.
It's funny now, just the last 2 years, somebody told me to read The Great Sex Rescue. Don't know if you've read it.
I have not.
So it's a Christian book about from a Christian author,
Mm-hmm.
but it's talking about how purity culture, Christian idea of sex, actually leads, and it's statistically shown, leads to bad sex.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think especially for women, because we're not allowed to have a sex drive in Christian whatever.
Right.
And I do try to talk about that a little bit in the book. We're either Virgin Mary or a whore. That's the Bible's idea of women.
Yeah.
So now, my husband and I, we have sex before marriage. And now looking back, I'm really happy we did.
Yeah. Yes.
Because I am a victim of childhood sexual assault, which disconnects you from your body. Christianity, which tells you your feelings are bad and you are bad, disconnects you from your body. And so as me and my husband at the time, fiance, were trying to ignore our body, but not doing it well, right?
Right. Right. Yeah.
It was the first time in my life, I realize now, where I was able to connect with my body.
Okay.
And I realized if I would have done the Christian way of being perfect, ignoring your body's urges, then you say a little promise, you end up half it you're supposed to then that night, right? It's okay,
Yeah.
on,
Exactly.
turn everything on. All of a sudden it goes from 0 to 100. And so knowing my own personal trauma, that probably would have destroyed me. It would have destroyed our marriage. I don't know if having sex and ignoring my body's whatever, I'm not ready yet, I don't know how I would have been able to heal. I know that would have been more damaging, is what I'm saying.
Right. Right.
So now I can look back at our first time with happiness. But sadly, I didn't have this realization while we were in it, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So
Yeah.
while we're in it, we would have, it was pleasurable and then it was shameful immediately after, right?
Right.
So
Right.
so it was so anyways, long story short, he the church has this pre-marriage counseling.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's
air
just
quotes
some scare
counseling.
quotes there. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Counseling by people who are not trained to be counselors. Well, the last meeting was on our purity, and my husband spills the beans, right? We are no longer pure. So 2 weeks before our wedding, he gets fired.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you're already engaged. The church knows
Yes.
that you're getting
Yes.
married.
We
And
both
you
are
are honest.
promised. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in marriage counseling or in premarital counseling, you admit that, or your husband admits that you've had sex and they fire him. Unbelievable.
Yes, absolutely. Which, yeah, again, just like let's load the shame on
Yes.
us. And yeah, so we end up having to like move in with his parents because that was his income.
Okay.
And so it started out our marriage really rough.
Okay.
And at that time, the pastor meets with us and she's like, okay, you can do X, Y, and Z for 9 months, and then we'll talk about coming back on staff.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, let's do that. I'm like, okay, I know how to try to be perfect. I'll go back to trying to be perfect. Where my husband's like, no, like he's mad. He feels like a failure. Also, they took away, like we were in ministry, he was on staff. We already had multiple outreach things going on,
Mm-hmm.
and they just dropped all of them or took them away and handed them to someone else. So he's really hurt by that. And does it at the time is just like, forget everything, right? So we're on two very different ends of the like reactionary spectrum. He starts drinking heavily. And I'm begging him to go to church.
Right. Okay.
So that's how we start our marriage. Yeah. It's like end up pregnant pretty quickly. Mothering my daughter while my husband's still in this angry, but not really dealing with it. That's the problem with alcohol, right? Is that you're not feeling the feelings. You're not, he's not deconstructing. He's not deciding what stays and goes. He's just mad and numbing the mad, right?
Sure.
Well, the pain under it.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Because anger, I've learned, is a second emotion, right? So there's the hurt that he's hiding from. So we're in that for a while. We actually find it's funny, we call it the church 2.0 because it was a church that was birthed out of leaders that left the first church I found at 16. So in the end, it ends up being the same problems, right? But at the time, it's a lot easier to blame the one pastor, right? And we hear this a lot with deconstructing and deconverting. It's like, oh, you got hurt by one person. But then for those of us who have left, like I guarantee it wasn't one person, right?
Yeah.
It was multiple people. You start to realize it's a system that is harmful. So at the time we didn't know that. It was the one pastor.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to identify it that way. And I think you've expressed it really well so far, just to say that purity culture, which is a major theme throughout your whole book, separates us from our bodies and our desires and very natural, normal things. And we're suppressing that. And as I've just been coming to learn that many, many people are affected by that. And even what you were describing, that having to go from 0 to 100 right off on the wedding night, so to speak, it does not work for many people.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And the heartbreaking is I've heard stories of people who ignore that. Like I've heard both, right? I've heard men who are gentle enough to be like, "Oh, you're not ready. Okay, well tonight we won't. And we're going to enjoy whatever level of intimacy we can have."
Right.
I've also heard the horror stories where it is traumatizing and the man is promised, "I get to have sex on this night, so I will with or without your, you know,
participation." Yeah.
Yes, right.
It tends to be better with the participation. So, yes.
Yeah, on all ends, right?
Yes. Yeah.
For all people involved. And that's where
Yes.
like I know with my background that would have destroyed. And it's funny because my husband is the most overly aware of my arousal and feelings. And I would joke with him that he was more connected to me than I was.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And not just physically, like he will tell me when when something emotionally is bothering me, because I'll start to get I am so disconnected from my feelings that it usually takes a week. Something will happen and I'll like ignore it or not realize like that bothered me. But I'll start to get short with people. I'll start to get irritable. I'll start whatever. And he'll be like, "Joe, something's going on."
Yeah.
Like, take a moment, figure out what's underneath here. Something hurt your feelings or something's wrong. But so, yeah, I would just joke that he is more connected to my feelings than I am. Working on that, though.
Yeah. Improving day by day. Okay.
So, anyways, we end up back at a church. And he spends 5 years stone sober, starts preaching at church.
Okay.
We're at a Calvary Chapel at the time. He'd preach like, pastor wants a day off or whatever. And then there was a church close by that had a pastor situation where they needed a pastor. So we go there a couple times to, I'll share this Sunday. Well, they end up offering him a pastorship.
Okay.
And
on the spot.
Well, yeah, I mean, fairly. It was like, we interviewed for it type of thing, went to dinner with the elders, blah, blah, blah. But it's a Calvary Chapel. And I grew up non-denominational, right? Where women are at least pretending to be equals.
Right. Okay. All right.
They're not head pastors, but they can be pastors, right? Okay. They can share at the pulpit. They can help lead a ministry. So like at 16, I was leading a small group, and I'm trying to think if I'd pray on the mic. I don't know if I ever did a sermon on the mic.
Sure.
I did do a sermon on the mic to a smaller group. Anyways, but
you were a leader in the church, though. You were a leader. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And a leader of the church and acknowledged, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
And so he's offered this pastorship at a Calvary Chapel. And I remember this conversation with him when I'm like, would I be able to like even share my testimony like from the pulpit? And he's like, I don't know. Maybe not. And so the book is Silenced in Eden, right? So the whole theme is that I had a hard time voicing my feelings, voicing for myself. So he's literally saying, if I take this job, you will have no voice.
Right.
And he says, I don't think so. Can you, like, are you okay with that? And I'm a people pleaser, right? I'm a female in a Christian church. So that's what I'm trained to be, is
Yes.
a
Yes.
people
From childhood.
pleaser.
Yes.
Yes. From birth, I come out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I couldn't answer him because I knew the answer I'm supposed to say, right? The people pleasing answer of, yes, of
Mhm.
course, babe, I'm totally fine with that. But in me, I was like screaming, no, I'm not okay with that. No, you can't lead and lead without me. You can't tell me to stay silent. And it took me a moment to be like, okay, what do I say here? Um, and for me, that was the little string that just unraveled everything.
Okay. Yeah.
That was the moment where I know, no, you can't. I'm not okay with that. No, I'm not okay that this is normal in any church. No, I'm not okay that women are expected to watch the children and help you write sermons, because I had written helped him work on most of them, and then
Wow. Okay.
have no voice. Like, yeah. I was like, no, mm-mm. And so, yeah, it was interesting. It was like an eye opening of the patriarchy of my whole life.
Okay.
I had been, until that point, I was fine with a woman's place, right? I mean, for me, I am really nurturing. So the idea of like, oh, you get to be a mom, I'm like, okay, that's fine. I love people. I love taking care of people. I can gladly be a mom. I'm not quiet. So
Okay.
that was
Okay.
the problem, right? In the church I went to when we were like 16, women were a lot of, I would say they were arm candy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they would be able to pray and lead and whatever, but it was Southern California. They were gorgeous. They wore high heels. Then there was me, where I was like a punk rocker. I had a studded belt, and I would
Okay.
jump in I would jump in a mosh pit. Like, I didn't fit the mold of what the church told me I was supposed to be. But I could definitely be a nurturing mom. Like, I could do that. And so I do feel like for me, when I got married, it was like this, like a mold. I was like, okay, I can try to fit in this, right? I can be a mom. I can be supportive. I can be a people pleaser. Like, I can fit in this mold. And that was the moment where like the mold broke. I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
We're done. And I'm super blessed that when my thread pulled, a different thread for him pulled.
Oh, okay. I want to pause just for a second, because one of the things I want to mention is how common this message is, that strong personality women who have natural born leadership qualities, and they find themselves trapped in, you can do church, you can do children's ministry, or you can, do director of education, but you can't preach in front of the congregation. And it amazes me, especially outside of the bubble, right? On this side of deconversion, that so many denominations are losing half of their talent pool
Right.
right off the bat. Like, I just think tactically it's stupid. And then obviously the devastating consequences if you are in fact a woman and you have these leadership qualities and you feel just completely contained and unable to use those gifts, to use the Christianese, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
just absurd. It's a complete absurdity. So
it is. And it's also crazy because you said half, but statistically, there's more women in church than there are men.
right. Good point. Yeah.
So it's funny. It's like you have more women, but those are the ones you want to say they have no place, or they have
Yeah.
no, yeah. So that's a
It's
funny
crazy.
reality.
I digress there. So you both are pulling on different strings, but the sweaters are unraveling.
Yes. we're unraveling. So for him, he did a sermon on I'm not sure exactly what it was. Maybe it was the Holy Spirit. Um, I just remember he got really into the word spirit
Okay.
and hell.
Okay.
And um he had, and I do put this in the book, he had an experience where he goes and he was at work. He was doing insurance claims. So he had to go into someone's house who had a flood. And the person was clearly a drug addict. The house
Mhm.
was in decay. Like there was trash all over the house. It was, um, and the guy looked nearly skeletal, like he's just wasting away.
Yeah.
And my husband was like, "This guy is in hell.
Yeah.
Like that's hell. I don't know how else to explain it, but that's hell."
Yeah.
Um, and so he did a deep dive into the word hell, um, and literally everything that Love Wins from Rob Bell. Like
Hmm.
he, without reading the book, came to all of the same, like, this is how the Bible explains hell. The hell isn't even really in the Bible.
It really isn't a thing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So that was one of the things for him that was like, wait a second. Um, and it was funny because during that time, it was like 2018. Um, we would have like, I would share this, this doesn't fit in my Christianity anymore. And he'd be like,
Yeah.
well, what about this? This doesn't make sense. And then I'd be like, wait, what? You can't question hell. And then I'd be
Right.
like, wait, that actually makes sense. And then the spirit, okay, there's actually no difference of the word Holy Spirit for spirit, our spirit. And so it was just one of those things where it was interesting. He would have one thing that had bothered him, right? That
Hmm.
didn't sit in his gut. Um, and it would come up, and then I would be like, wait, you can't question that. And then I'd listen, and I'd be like, oh, that makes sense, actually.
Right.
and,
Right.
and vice versa. Um,
You both were sliding down that slippery slope together.
yes. Yes. Well, and it was
Yeah.
funny because there was definitely times where it would be like, I would grab him and be like, catch up.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he'd be like,
Yeah.
wait, now you.
Exactly.
But yeah, so clearly he decided not to become a pastor.
Okay.
um, and for him, at that time, for him, we were at a church. The pastor who was there had some inappropriateness with a younger secretary or something.
Okay.
Something where the power play would be unethical as well than
Hmm.
just an affair, right? And I don't think it was an actual affair, but the point was that something was icky. And so
Sure. Okay.
the pastor left. Um, and the congregation was really sad and lost. And my husband went to the elders and was like, I don't see why you guys are still having like a Sunday service. Like, why don't we go back to like a house church, try to build this community back where we heal whatever hurt has been done, and then we'll start church like once we feel like that process is over.
Okay.
um and they were all like, no, we want to have our Sunday service, we want to print our pamphlets, we want to, and for both me and him, we're like, this is playing church. Like,
Yeah.
this is a show, there's no real depth, there's no community here. um is this what church really is?
Mm.
And so it was that realization of like, okay, for them, church is this. It is a band that shows up and people fill in a room, sing a song, hear something we like, right? Oh, we want a younger pastor because we want you to bring some life. Okay, we want, and it's just this, there was just not the depth anymore.
You passed over very quickly that he didn't become a pastor, but in the book, I think you really describe that both of you are pretty dedicated to ministry. You that's like your vision for your life is
Mm-hmm.
ministry. So my question is, when you made that decision, did you think you had already started to deconstruct enough that it wasn't traumatic, or was that a loss of a sense of like your purpose in life at that point?
Yeah. So when we started deconstructing, it was yeah, I think we had already gotten to the point where this doesn't feel right. Like
Okay.
this church is not just that this church is broken, maybe all church is broken.
There we go. Okay, got it. Yeah.
So once we had that, yeah, once we had that piece of like, wait, I think that this church is showing us what all church is. All
Yeah.
churches are people playing happy, people playing uh whole, and it's actually maybe it's really just a facade, and there's
Hmm.
not the depth that we want it to have.
Right.
Because yeah, the reality was for us, church was the deeper. Like we both came to church and like got dedicated when we were in high school, and it was our whole life, and it was where we had friends, it was where we had these emotional experiences. um so it was, for us, it always was relational. Like we wanted to
Right.
do ministry because, I mean, all these young people that we care about are dying and going to hell in our
Mm.
minds. So we need to
Okay.
save
Yeah.
them all. And there was, I'm not sure if it was on your guys's group, Deconversion Anonymous. It probably was, but there was one about, there was a social media post about
Hmm.
if people really thought, if Christians really believed in hell, then they would like it would break their hearts.
Yeah.
Something like that. And I
Yeah.
remember being like, that was me.
Okay.
I was
Yeah.
I was the Christian who literally, like, I remember staying certain nights, staying up until 2 a.m. crying over people that I thought were going to go to hell. I was the person who was like, I can't let these people I care about or anyone go to hell because I hate people in pain. Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
I would rather be the one in pain. Let me have the pain. Don't let them have the pain. So I think that for my husband Josh and I, we what we liked about Christianity that we had was the depth, the
Right.
interconnectedness. So when church became this plastic shell of um a, I don't know what you'd call it, like a social club, right? When we started seeing church as a social club, we're like, no, this isn't what we thought it was. So I don't want to lead something that's that.
Right. Okay.
So it was a lot easier to leave the idea of ministry at that point.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
I do think that there's been, for me specifically, that is something that I still feel the loss of. Um, but it's been like, sometimes there's things where you're like, oh, I don't want that. But then you don't realize like what you're missing now.
Sure.
I don't know if that makes sense, but it's, I guess I didn't feel the loss while deconstructing, but I feel it now.
Yeah. Yeah. We talk a lot about that. There are good aspects
Right.
of church, right? It's the built-in community. People that are there who care about you when you're sick. Hopefully, they come and bring you food and ask about your children and maybe babysit for you and all those things. Like having that interconnectedness is really important as a human being. And there are not great solutions for that in the secular world. So, like, there's definite aspects of that. And then that design, just what you're describing, again, your natural talent as a leader to want to be a part of that, to foster more community, to bring people together, and maybe not having the venue to do that in
Right.
the secular world is a loss. And we can acknowledge that and recognize that it's sad.
Yeah, looking at, it's interesting once the cards fall and you look back and you can find certain points of your life where you're like, oh, that never sat well with me, or
Hmm.
that's why
Hmm.
I did that. And so now I look back and I'm like, oh, well, that's why when my husband and I went to the church 2.0,
Uh-huh.
um, they were doing us. We were in a small group, and the small group wanted to go over Sunday's notes. So we'd hear a sermon on Sunday, and then we'd
Hmm.
talk about it on Tuesday, whatever day it was.
Sure.
And I remember going to the leader, and I was like, no.
Yeah.
Here I am, the strong, dominant woman. I was like, no, we shouldn't do that. And I asked him, I was like, why don't we all take turns and share our testimony? Why don't we all take turns and share part of our life and why we're Christians? Because I want that connectedness. I want to learn about these people sitting in a room that I'm trying to have, quote, fellowship with, right? I want to get to know them. I don't want to talk about the pastor's 5-point message. I want to get to know my person next to me.
Yeah.
And he let me do that, or let us do that. And the people who are in that group have said, like, that was the best small group we ever have been a part of. And so it's interesting now. I'm like, oh, I saw the surface and knew that there was surfaceness already and was trying to find depth. So it was like I already knew that something was off, right? I already knew that there was something wrong in the church. I was just trying to tweak it to still make it work for me.
Right. This also reminds me of what I call church shopping, that you start, there's some nagging thing that's missing, and you start to look around like, well, maybe it's over here, or this denomination, or this tradition. And you're looking to fulfill the thing that you know ought to be there, but isn't. And that is the beginning of the end, right? It's going to end in tears.
It can be. It's interesting when I said my grandfather's church ended. I was really young. And then we went to Calvary Chapel. We went to First Baptist. Like during that entire time, my dad was desperately church shopping.
Okay. Okay.
He would we would have the church we'd go to, and then on every random Sunday, he would just show us up at some other church because he was not happy. And I don't know if he's been happy in a church since my grandpa's church.
Right. Okay.
But he's still at church.
I understand. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But I imagine that nagging feeling is still there.
It might
right?
be.
And if he were aware of that and able to articulate it.
Right. It might be. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's still there and he's just a little more resilient in his faith than I was.
Yeah.
So yeah, we left that behind. And I it's interesting. I'm trying to think when it was really done. Like deconstruction is such an interesting thing, and it wasn't until really recently that I would even say deconversion.
Okay. Yeah.
Because
That's
it
honest.
was kind of, it was, and there's also the level of coming out of the closet, right? It's deconstructing is like, okay, well, you're just asking questions. You're still a Christian. You're still with us. You're still in our tribe. You're still a part. And hopefully you'll come back to the truth.
Right.
Deconversion is like, all right, you're out.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly.
Yeah. And I even recently I had the well, then what are you? A person? I'm a person.
Well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so there was a time where I was like, okay, I'm done with the term Christianity. I feel like it's done harm to me. I feel like it's done harm to many cultures. And my husband was kind of like, yeah, I understand that, but wouldn't tell me where he was at. And that was hard. I was like, okay, am I alone in that? Are we good? And then very recently, he was like, yeah, no, I don't think I would call myself a Christian either. And I was like, oh, cool. Okay, we're on the same page again. I thought I had just gone all the way down the hill and you were still up right there, not going to move. So for me, I'm really glad that we rode that ride together. It wasn't super easy because like I said, there were times where he'd question something and I wouldn't, or he would want to go to church on, Easter and Christmas, or at one point he was talking about going once a month just because this is these stories that we grew up with. It's part of our culture, right? It's my parents are still Christian. Our culture is Christian, basically. And so he was like, I don't know if I'm okay with like my kids not knowing Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark. And I was like, well, can I tell you why each one of those I don't want my kids to know?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm okay with my daughters not hearing that Eve was the reason sin came into the world.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that one. I'm okay with my kids not hearing that God flooded the whole earth and only saved this handful of people. Like I'm actually totally fine with my kids not having any of that. And yes, that was a funny time where he was like, and it's so ironic to me too, because for those 4 years of him self-numbing and me pulling him into church, like I was the one being like, come on, babe, this is our raft, this is our safety net, like God is everything. And so it was ironic when the shoe was on the other foot and he was like, come on, Joe, just once in a while.
Right.
But yeah, as of now, we're both, I guess I think we'd say agnostic. I do think that the secular humanist is probably more where I would land. I love the idea, again, like with this podcast, I love the idea of human helping human.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The labels are not important. Like,
Yes.
it's sometimes helpful as a shorthand to talk to one another, but really we're just talking about caring about people. And it really is that simple. And like we make it too complex. And I think the side of the podcast that is important is embracing your own humanity. So we've talked about in this conversation, one's own sexuality, your own desires, your connection to your body, all of those things that have been denied you through your life. I think that part's important. And then whatever label you put on it just isn't. So,
right. No, I definitely agree. And it's funny on this side of deconversion because like in my childhood upbringing, an atheist was like,
oh yeah.
like I remember my dad talking at one point when I think I was in like 4th, 5th grade, they started doing evolution at school. And surprisingly at the time I was at a public school. My parents had shifted gears a little because at first we were homeschooled.
Okay.
And so because I was at a public school and they tried to get me out of the science of evolution, they asked the teacher even if I could do something else, right? Because evolution is evil. So when the school said no, my dad's workaround was putting on young Earth movies when I got home.
Okay.
So I would literally go to school, right? And then at home be given school, just young Earth school. And so I think it was in that time when I first heard what an atheist was. Of course, it's from the Christian idea of an atheist where they don't believe in anything. They hate God. And so it is funny because now I'm like especially with this podcast, well, this looks a whole lot more loving and kind, but this is an atheist.
Yeah. That's what we're playing with. I mean, that's why, I've said it many times, I could have called this the graceful humanist, but it was kind of intentional to say, to break down that stereotype a bit. And, like I've said too, when I meet somebody, I don't go, hi, I'm an atheist.
Which is a turnaround. Which is a turnaround because when you're a Christian, it is, hi, I'm a Christian.
Exactly. Yeah. If someone does ask, I will talk about secular humanism. And, if we get it deep, then I'll start talking about secular grace and, my conception of that kind of thing.
I love it. I love that you did choose atheist. Because I think there is taking what Christianity for those who are deconverting has like tainted and turned it into something evil, right? And being
Yeah.
like, here, this is it. It's not evil. It's not scary. It's not bad. It just is.
Yes. Well, you said very kind things about the podcast. What other resources, podcasts or books or people have you found really helpful throughout this process?
So when I first started looking into my specific upbringing, I started obsessing about like books on people leaving in cults more specifically.
Okay.
Um, so I read Girl at the Edge of the World and Girl at the End of the World,
Hmm.
um, Undertow, Unfollow. So ones that come to mind.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
some books on people who left, which was why I was like, I writing for me is processing my feelings. I'm so disconnected from my feelings that it's easier to type it or write it and like see it on paper almost because I have a
Yeah.
hard time seeing it in myself. Um, but so when I started writing for my own therapy, if you want to call it, I was like, I should put this out because memoirs were what literally like were my lifeline at the beginning of leaving.
Yeah.
So those were some books. And then for podcasts, I'm like, I guess I'm picky.
Yeah.
um,
Me too.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really like Dirty Rotten Church Kids. They're like my age group. Sadly, this is their last season, so I'm gonna
Okay.
have to find something else. Yeah, this is a podcast I do listen to. I'm trying to think if there's any other. Oh, the fundamental. I grew up with Christian fundamentalists.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, sorry, it's I
I
was
was
a
a teenage.
teenage
Yeah. Mhm.
fundamentalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those are some. But a lot of times I'll just do books. Hashtag Church 2 was one I read recently.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Yeah.
that one was really good. Gets into purity culture, gets into how women are treated. And then if for specifically like my book talks about the sexual abuse side.
Okay.
So Chanel Miller's "Know My Name" is an amazing book
Okay.
um, that I would strongly recommend for anybody who either wants to understand what sexual trauma does to the brain in a person or who have lived that. Um, that book was amazing. But yeah, a lot of times I'll do books on Audible. Books on Audible are my like
Okay.
go to.
Yeah.
And I am on Deconversion Anonymous.
Excellent.
Yeah. Recently, I read God and Sex by the same guy who did The God Virus.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Uh, that book was like blow my mind. I'm
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
okay. Um, in the book, I at the very end, I talk about how like I felt like I hit a point where I stopped deconstructing everything. Like before it was like I had a sledgehammer and I was just pulling down everything, right? And
Hmm.
I was like, maybe I'm at a point where I can like get a broom, start cleaning this up.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah.
and
Okay. All right.
and then I read that book and I was like, okay, maybe I need another sledgehammer.
There's a bit more
There's a little more
deconstructed
here.
to do. Yes. Yeah.
A
Yeah.
little
I hear
more
you.
cultural, stuff that there's stuff that is like clearly church, right? And you can
Yeah.
deconstruct that and then it's like, oh, okay, maybe there is some validity to this gender stuff or this um yeah, just the culture. And then I'm like, oh, maybe I want to pull down some of this stuff too.
Exactly.
That's where
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
at.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It is definitely a process and it can go on for a while. I definitely want to give you a minute to talk about anything about the book, how people can find the book, let's just promote it.
Okay. Yeah. So the book is Silenced in Eden. The books. People have asked me like, why Silenced in Eden?
Mm-hmm.
So I was born in a Christian commune where they separate themselves. They tried to build their perfect Eden, the perfect
Mm-hmm.
idea
Okay.
of God again, right? And through trauma and through being female and a child, I wasn't given a voice. So that's why it's Silenced in Eden. I was silenced, and they thought it was perfect. They thought it was a garden. I explain Christianity as like a perfectly kept garden where everything has its specific place. And then realizing at one point, like, I'm not a garden. I'm kind of wild. Maybe I'm the forest.
I love that analogy. I think that was
Yeah.
great. Yeah. Yes.
The book talks about purity culture. It talks about patriarchy. Uh, for me, I spent my first 35 years being told what to do, being preached at. So the book is not that, right? I'm not saying this is what you should believe. I'm saying this is my, like, what I went through. This is
Mm-hmm.
my path of life. These are the things that when I was in Christianity didn't fit, didn't seem to work, didn't feel right. And then these are the things that I'm starting to be like, hey, this feels better. Hey, this sits better. And so I try very much to be like, this is where I'm at, and hopefully the reader can find things that resonates with them, but I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm not going to tell you if there's a heaven or a hell. That's you. Like, that's on you.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you my experience with deconstructing hell, right? So
Yeah.
yes, the book is on Amazon. So I partnered with Louder Than Silence. Louder Than Silence is an organization that fundraises to help women who have been sexually abused
Okay.
get EMDR therapy. So they pay for therapy,
Mm-hmm.
um, and they also do workshops. So I'm a part of one that starts actually it just started, um, and the whole idea of the workshop is for victims to help other victims. So it's all
Okay.
ran by victims, and
Mm-hmm.
they have, we talk about feeling your feelings. Okay, today we're going to work on what emotions are coming up and how, so it's all human helping human.
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
and so for me, like that was why I was like, okay, this is the organization. I knew when I put the book out, like, I'm talking about a crazy subject. I want this to help that subject. I want to do something good with my messed up story, right? More
Yeah.
than just promote myself or whatever. Like, I want it to do something good. So a dollar for every book goes to that organization. If you are a woman out there who has been victimized and you want to heal, Louder Than Silence has workshops. We meet for 12 weeks. You will meet other victims completely anonymous. And then they also will help with the cost of EMDR therapy.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. Joe Johnson, you are the author of Silenced in Eden. I can tell the listeners that, the story is very raw and and real, and I appreciate that. I think just like what we're doing here on the podcast, telling your story is so powerful. People are going to read that, and especially those who've been through sexual trauma will recognize themselves and hopefully gain some healing from that. So thank you, Joe, for being on the podcast.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Final thoughts on the episode. As you could hear, Joe is an obvious leader and an outspoken voice to help people. I'm always amazed at that women who are held back, who have a real sense of ministry in their lives, and because of the sexism and patriarchy within the church, are limited to the roles that they can take. Even her describing writing her husband's sermons is just amazing to me. And then not being allowed to speak in the pulpit. One of the core values of the podcast is rigorous self-honesty. And my belief is that when we are deeply honest about ourselves and vulnerable, that helps others. Jo exemplifies that in telling her story of the sexual trauma she experienced as a child and the impact that had throughout her life, as well as the impact of purity culture on her and the people that she has talked to that have been affected by purity culture as well. I know many of the listeners might be in that category, if not in the sexual trauma category as well. So I want to thank Jo for being vulnerable and telling her story. I think it's going to help many, many people. Again, I want to point out that Jo says that $1 from every book sale goes to Louder Than Silence. That helps survivors of sexual trauma and gives them a community to build from. There will be links in the show notes so you can find that. If you yourself have experienced sexual trauma, please reach out. The book is Silenced in Eden. It is fantastic. I couldn't put it down. I read a lot of stories. I don't say this about every guest's book. This was great. It was compelling. Jo really has a way of letting you feel the experience that she had. I want to thank Jo for being on the podcast and for being so vulnerable and telling her story. Thank you, Jo, so much. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is about that rigorous self-honesty. If you've ever been in a 12-step program, you're going to recognize that phrasing. This is a core value for me, and I want to differentiate it from the way that truth is often used as a cudgel within Christianity, or even in the atheist community. There's a way of using the truth to beat people over the head as opposed to helping them to thrive. And so juxtapose that with what I'm trying to describe here about a rigorous self-honesty, a truthfulness with oneself. I often quote Alice Gretchen, who said that she stopped being good at fooling herself. And I love that. I want us all to stop being good at fooling ourselves, and it begins with rigorous self-honesty. And this applies very deeply for those people who are in the middle of their doubts, the middle of deconstruction, who are counting the cost of what deconversion might cost, and terrified. All I can say is that within the sanctity of your own mind, be honest with yourself. The truth, in that sense, will set you free. Next week's guest is Josh, who goes by After God's End on Instagram. Arlene interviews Josh. Definitely check that out next week. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios podcast network.